Okay, good evening, commissioners, city staff, general public. It's really great to have a full complement of in-person, all of our commissioners. Welcome. I'd like to call to order the October 12th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting to order. And shall we rise for the flag salute, please?
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call.
Chair Barbe? Here. Commissioner Jones? Here. Commissioner Poole? Vice Chair Rainey?
Present.
Commissioner Ramirez? Present. Commissioner Serrato?
Here.
And Commissioner Weiler?
Here.
Great. I'd like to review the minutes from August 24th, 2021. I know that seems like a long time ago, but there are minutes. Are there any comments or questions or discussion of the minutes? Commissioners? Hearing none, I'd like to, is there a motion? Make a motion for approving the minutes?
The motion to approve the minute.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Weiler. Minutes are approved. Okay, sorry? Sorry, we have to vote on that. Vote on the minutes. Approved.
Commissioner Jones?
Approve.
Commissioner Poole?
Yes, approved.
Vice Chair Rainey?
Can I approve it if I wasn't there? Oh, yes.
Chair, only if you listen to the recording and if you read the minutes, but if not, you can just
Abstain.
Commissioner Ramirez?
Abstain.
Commissioner Serrato?
Yes, approved.
Commissioner Weiler?
Yes.
Vote is 5 to approve with 2 abstaining.
Thank you. Are there written communications? I understand there's one.
Yes, there is one. It is from a Kristen Bush, and she says, "I'd love to see commercial or retail development like One Paseo and Del Mar and Escondido. Are there any plans to bring in walkable commercial retail spaces such as this?"
Okay, thank you. Future neighborhood meetings?
I don't know. Is it great? No, there's nothing scheduled at this time.
Oral communications, are there any requests, as I understand it? No, none at this time. Okay, there are no public hearings. We launch right into current business. And the first business item is Classical Academy shared parking. The request is a joint use parking agreement to allow the Classical Academy Middle School use a portion of City of Escondido's Woodward Avenue parking lot for staff parking and student drop-off and pickup. Staff presentation.
Excuse me, Chair. I do have a disclosure letter going.
Apologies, yes, disclosure.
And I'm going to have to recuse myself from this item because my company is doing work for Classical Academy.
Right, so if you could step out.
So just let me know when we're on to the next item.
Okay, we'll let you know. I'll try not to forget. Thank you, Stan.
Yes, good evening, Chairman and Commissioners. My name is Darren Parker, Associate Planner for the Community Development Department. Classical Academy that operates multiple schools across Escondido County is requesting a shared parking agreement with City of Escondido. Classical Academy first opened its doors in Escondido in 2000. Since then, the school now operates several buildings along Woodward Avenue and most recently along Washington Avenue. As a result of this expansion of the campus and increasing attendees, 33 additional parking spaces are being required. To address this need, condition of approval was included with the most recent project to provide off-street parking through one of two options. The first option was to require the middle school staff to use parking approximately 1/4 of a half mile away. Option 2 was to enter into a shared parking agreement with the city of Escondido for use of the Woodward Avenue parking lot across the street. The applicant is requesting approval of option 2. There is excess parking available in the Woodward lot to use. The shared parking agreement will be used for faculty and staff parking, morning drop-off, and afternoon pickup only. And with that, staff is recommending the approval of the project.
Thank you. Questions, clarification, staff?
Yeah, Darren, I just had one question. In the attachments, there are two Exhibit Cs. There's two Exhibit A's and two Exhibit B's, but those are the same. But then there's an Exhibit C called the Shared Parking Agreement, which is something that will be filed with the clerk of the county. And then there's another C. Called depiction of parking spaces and description of student drop-off.
So Exhibit C is the actual shared parking agreement.
So, Commissioner Paul, if I can, this is Adam Feinstone, I'm the interim director. The Exhibit C, that is the actual shared parking agreement, this sheet here, this is Exhibit C to the resolution. The Exhibit C you see later in there is Exhibit C to the shared parking agreement, so when that document gets recorded, that Exhibit C is going to be the drop-off or what is it called?
So essentially, both of those are Exhibit C. They'll be
One of
combined.
them is Exhibit C to the other document, right? So Exhibit C is an exhibit to the resolution. That document, when you pull that out, has its own exhibits.
And we'll have to renumber the pages. I see there's a little confusion because the footer says shared parking agreement in the resolution as well as the shared parking agreement. So we'll get the page renumbered once that's signed.
That's it.
That was it. Other questions? Clarification? So as I understand it, there will be there's no payment, there's no leasing of this property, of the parking spaces, correct? In other words,
You are
there's no
correct.
payment to the city, it's just an agreement to let them do their thing.
Yes, you're correct.
And also, if I read it correctly, the city can terminate this agreement at any time.
It can, with a 3-day written notice.
Right. Yeah, my interest there was just simply about, later future build out elements for redevelopment of that space. Okay. Any other concerns? Questions? Want to make a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to approve.
Ingrid making a motion to approve, second.
Yeah, I'll second.
Okay, right. Commissioner Paul, thank you. Roll call.
Chair Barbeau,
Approved.
Commissioner Dome,
Approved.
Commissioner Paul,
Yes, approved.
Vice Chair Rainey,
Approved.
Commissioner Ramirez,
Approved.
Commissioner Serrano,
Approve.
and Commissioner Vote is 6-0. Commissioner Weiler. That's it.
Someone tell Commissioner Weiler to come back. Thank you. Okay, moving right along here to the Escondido Creek Trail. This is a request for Planning Commission design review of the potential improvements to the existing Escondido Creek Trail. As I understand it, this is simply a review and solicitation of input. There's not a recommendation involved.
Right.
Thank you.
So, good evening, Chair, County Commissioners. Sean Nicholas, Principal Planner. This item, as stated by Chair Barbeau, is for the improvements to the Escondido Creek Trail. Just a bit of history in terms of the site. Originally, developed in the late 1990s. In 2012, there was a master plan that was envisioned and approved by the city council. Recently, the city has received grant funding from Prop 68. From that funding, we are utilizing some of those funds to create designs based on that master plan that was approved by the city council, and also to address all CEQA-related items. And also that grant will also deal with the implementation of the initial improvements for the trail itself. As required by the Escondido zoning code, this item is before you this evening for design review. So the proposed project in front of you is primarily a fencing project with an emphasis on activation of the trail. That includes improvements for safety, lighting, landscaping, hardscape, and softscape improvements. And while I would love to be able to wax on and on about all these great attributes, I'm going to actually turn it over now to Brian Hennigan with RM, who is the lead designer and consultant with the city of Escondido, and let him tell you about all of these great things in much more eloquent and informed terms we can get it. Here you go. Mr. Hennigan.
Good evening, everybody. Brian Hennigan with RR Design Group. I'll just take you on a tour of where we are on the project and a little context. So here we go. So Sean had mentioned some of the background on the trail over the last 10 years or so. We're over on the right side there, 2020 into 2021, 22. We're in the design and environmental stage. Construction anticipated for the year 2022. To date, we've had stakeholder meetings. Last fall, we were in schematic design through that process. We met with the community at a workshop number 1. That's a virtual meeting. And as we continued on the design and furthering it, we had another community workshop, and that was in person back in June. So that takes us to about in the midway of 90% construction documents. So this is just a photo of one of, sorry about that, of the workshop that we had recently. We had laid out the trail on 2 tables so that people could see it all in one go, so that way you can see it end to end and walk along the whole alignment. It's several miles long, so it's hard to see when it's on pieces of individual sheets, so that was kind of fun. And there's a lot of excitement about seeing it laid out like that. We got comments and to go further. Just going to take you on a little tour of the site, overall context. So from Harmony Grove all the way to Midway, and even El Norte, we're hoping to stretch some of the grant funding with signage, and so we'll kind of tie it together there. The new Staccato Bridge is gone out to bid for construction, and that portion will be done by the time, or close to it by the time the trail project is built. So we'll be connecting the segment from Harmony Grove to the new bridge as part of the extension of this project for the trail. And then just some other areas along the way, this link segment along the Valley Parkway, just for orientation, Big Park, Washington Park. So the grant covers, the primary part of the grant will cover the area between Broadway and Rose. That's where the most of the funding will be spent in that primary area. And then secondary areas would be, as I mentioned earlier, the connection from Harmony Grove to the Staccato Bridge, and then Rose to Midway would be also secondary improvements. And then the minor improvements in between, like I said earlier, the signage and some of those things don't tie together. So there's just some photo images of those segments of the corridor. The photo in the middle, the top there is the current asphalt path that will connect into the Chicago Bridge. We'll restripe that and the signage for the trail to extend to Harmon Road. Transit Center, which connects into the Inland Rail Trail. And then that's at Great Day and Broadway. Date will be doing improvements to the Date crossing on the north and south side. Some of the areas along the path where we have some room for there's community gardens, there will be outdoor fitness and pollinator gardens where we have the room to do it. And then typical segments of the trail is fairly narrow, following the convenience road. There's 6 intersections that will receive new crossings, new pedestrian and bike crossings. Example there on the right, the blow up of Rose Street shows how those will look. Well, the curbs will be bumped out and crosswalks will be added with signal flashers for pedestrians. So those 6 locations are Juniper, Hickory, Big, Hardin, Rose, and Midway. There's a similar one that was done in Queens a year or 2 ago. Those will be constructed before the trails built, so they'll already be in place. So on the north side of the creek corridor, we're putting in a DG trail, which is decomposed granite, softer surface than asphalt, and landscaping. I just have a photo example of how that looks in this little, and some exhibits showing some of those amenities. We'll have the DG path, seating areas, the outdoor fitness, and planted areas along the edge. 5 will have in some areas between Rose and Broadway and Rose will have fencing, cable fencing in there. We'll fit it up a little bit, and then new lighting from Date to Midway and from Midway to Ash. Here's an example of one of the pollinator gardens that's just west of Date, the Date Street crossing, or Date Bridge crossing. On the south and parts of the north side, there's the existing trail, asphalt trail. We'll be restriping, landscape, seating areas, water bottle filling stations. You get tight on that, so I have to slow down. And then again, the fencing and lighting. The photo rendering on the left is we're looking for opportunities for public art on some of the buildings that face the corridor. And the city's been in discussion with some of the owners and talking about how that's going to go about for those enhancements. We'll be doing some decorative fencing. This exhibit shows silhouettes of people on bikes and walking, hiking along the creek crossings. We felt this would be kind of a fun way to celebrate where the trail is. A lot of times when you're driving down the street, you don't really catch that it's right there. So this would be a way to both give people driving a heads up that there's people walking. And the mid-block crossing, or mid-block crossing with the in there. Some of the fencing that we'll be doing along the corridor, we're doing a concrete split rail fence where the trail comes to meet the roadways. We want to create a little more of like a park feel to it and try and take out some of the chain link as much as possible. So these are ways we can do that and have a little more decorative fencing. There are currently fencing projects going on, as mentioned earlier, with the really the type B fence on the left there is the metal fence. There are some areas where there's chain link. Currently, like Queen State, they put the black chain link, but we're really leaning toward trying to do the metal fences. And then we have the decorative fence with the graphics. We'll probably do those at up to 6 intersections, probably not all of them. And then the cable fence along the creek edge will kind of give it a little more open feel. This will be a 54-inch high fence, so it's the code for bikes and pedestrians. Some of the outdoor fitness elements we'll have are going to be more connected, just non-moving parts to the equipment. Some outdoor play areas along the trail. These are just some examples of those facilities. We're looking at wayfinding signs and kind of a branding. The city already has the archway that you see on the right, and we'll be kind of picking up signage from one end to the other to tie it all together and just help with wayfinding. These are some of the trees that will be along the corridor. These are from the city's tree list. They're all California-friendly plants and include the shrubs and conifers that we have for the project. So arbutus and cercis and actually a lot of them that you see in town. Some of the shrubs and conifers that we have for the project in California-friendly plants, all water-wise and roads to climate. Some part of the flowering and native plants along the corridor. And then just real quick, I'll take you through some of what we presented to the public at the workshops and just showing a graphic of where those facilities are being added, the water filling stations, seating, the pollinator gardens. So those symbols just kind of are along the way from, we'll start with Broadway and work our way to the east. And then you'll see kind of the trees along the corridor there. These little symbols there. We also show trees that are adjacent to the trail, the canopies from those adjacent trees, because we refer to it as borrowed landscape, and we have a nice large tree that's on a different property, but it does provide shade. So we put those on there just to show an example of how those existing trees are added to the trail experience. And then we have some highlighted little bubbles there showing what we're doing in those areas where we're adding the outdoor fitness stations. We're looking at new paving, treatments at date. We're using kind of native basket weave patterns for the pavement as an artistic way to address the new pavement areas in that area. We've been working with the local tribes on some of those basket weave patterns, which has been kind of fun and exciting. And then, as I mentioned, there's this example of the wall murals at the bottom there. Pollinator gardens, and we'll have some shade shelters along the path. We chose the shade structure with 2 posts because we're trying to be careful with all the utilities. The corridor is a fairly narrow corridor on both sides, so we'll be providing shade in a careful sort of way with the structures. And again, we just show the crossings where we do treatments. Some more of the active play area for the kids that will be in Washington Park. Washington Park will have one of the large fitness areas in the corner right by the baseball diamond. So the trail will actually drop down into Washington Park, and we'll have the outdoor play areas and the fitness structure in that area. We have some room to do it. It's probably the area where we have the most room on the corridor, so it's a good spot for that. And then road goes to Midway. It's fairly narrow through there, or on but it's also considered the maintenance road, which is the trail. We have about, on average, it's about 15 feet from the trail edge to the fences and private property. So it's a fairly narrow corridor. We'll be able to plant some trees along those segments of the trail. And it just shows the crossing down the bottom at those. And that is it.
Thank you.
So, just to bring it back and to wrap it up, and we'll be able to bring up those images if there's additional questions. But a few items I just wanted to note is, again, the goal here of the project as it currently exists today is to primarily create a design up to, for the whole trail length, up to about 60 or so %. And then on top of that, we're going to do the CEQA for the full improvement, for all the improvements. And then, as Ryan said, that we have a lot of focus in terms of that kind of primary area, and then some smaller improvements, ending more with signage and other types of striping, and whatnot, as you get to more of the end. Just because of, honestly, funding. And so the key thing about doing the CEQA now and doing the 60% documents, as it allows us to apply for grants. It allows us to show that, hey, we have this, in essence, shovel-ready project ready to go. So there is a benefit to the city in the long term. So while, again, we are talking about these beautiful stretches and all these amazing plantings and facilities and amenities that we're ultimately going to get. But again, it's still just that focus area, and then as we continue to get funding, we'll get to see those areas built out over the years. So I just wanted to highlight that again to kind of keep it in focus in terms of expectation of ultimately what we're getting with the project. In terms of CEQA, we are in the process of completing and drafting a mitigated negative declaration. I'd like to highlight that we've met with all the tribes, and they would have been, I would say, generally supportive of the project. And as Brian has indicated, we're also working with the tribes in terms of some interesting public art to showcase their basket weavings and the history and their place within our community. And so they were very appreciative of that, and actually they thought that was a very appropriate way to be recognized and associated with the project. And ultimately, the CEQA document, once completed, will be approved by City Council when the contract is rewarded for that development of that primary work that's going to be done with that initial phasing, as I said. So, and that's, as Brian indicated, probably in that first to second quarter of 2022. So, ultimately, staff does just recommend that the Planning Commission support the proposed amenities and improvements on the Escondido Creek Trail, and that really does conclude our presentation. But myself and members of the community service and public works team, as well as Mr. Hannigan, are here to address and answer any questions that the commissioners may have.
Thank you, Mr. Nicholas. Questions? Vice Chair Rainey.
I thought it was well thought out. Thank you for the presentations. I love the decorative fences. I think that's great to give people a heads up as they're driving. When you say 60% of it is funded,
No.
what did I miss?
So the funding is there for up to 60% of the design for the whole trail, because when you have these types of projects, as for example, in your staff reports, you were given the link to the landscape plans, right? And those landscape plans are about at the 60% completeness of what it will take to actually, in essence, go out and do the project and build. So that's what we mean by a 60% completion of the plan set.
Okay, great. Yep, you answered that. Thank you.
Pleasure. Welcome back.
Thank you. Other questions? Commissioner Paul?
Thank you. Yeah, so do we get any on the ground work?
When you say 60, we're going to say 60% of the design done. Are we going to get any trees planted and
Yes.
seats? And
So-
that is confusing.
So I think it's probably better shown here on the other presentation. We'll pull up Mr. Hannigan's project here, and it gets to this slide right here. So as you can see, in terms of all of those improvements, and particularly as Mr. Hannigan showed at the end of his presentation, in terms of from, as you can see on here, Broadway to Rose in Washington Park, that is the vision of what will be, those improvements will be on the ground in terms of that type of thing. Now, in terms of some of the public artwork and things, there's still agreements that probably will occur and that will trail along some of those public amenities, but like you're saying, the landscaping, the trees, the improvements, the fencing, like, yes, to answer your question, that will all be installed.
Okay, cool. And so if you can go to the plant palette, he had a couple pages of trees, but I looked at the landscaping plan, and those trees aren't what's in the landscaping plan. The only one that's on here is the wax one. All the other trees that are on the landscaping plan are not on the palette.
So I can let Mr. Hannigan come up here and maybe talk about how that's evolved. As I said, what was provided to the commission this evening is the 60% landscaping plan, which is what I had when we were preparing this. As I said, this primary portion is going all the way to 100% design, and so I know Mr. Hannigan has been working to develop and increase the diversity and potential trees to be utilized in these areas. So I believe that's the situation here, as you're seeing here, the newest, latest, and greatest that we want to be able to present to the planning commission, and so you're seeing the further development of the plan and concepts that will be, and species that will be planted. So if you're good with that, or would you like to hear further from Mr. Hannigan?
I'd like to hear from Brian, sure.
Commissioner Paul. Yeah, so the plans that you received were 60% construction drawings. And we've since got comments back from city staff and worked with our group to now we're heading into the 90%. And we were finding the corridor being very narrow, as I mentioned before. It's has a lot of utilities in the corridor, sewer and water lines that we have to be really careful with. So all the trees that you see on the plans that you reviewed, the locations are all going to still be the same, but we had to change out some of the species because of the city ordinances on some of those larger trees being in those narrow areas. So we went back to the tree palette and tried to make sure that the trees that we're putting in there are able to go in those narrower areas of the project. So that's why some of the species you'll see are changing out.
So when it's ultimately built, it's going to be the trees that we're looking at on this slide?
Yes.
Oh, I like the other trees much better. The other trees were more, there's actually two natives. There aren't any native trees on this palette. What do you think about that? Bolivia, Korea, there's one from southwest U.S. and Mexico. None of the other trees are natives.
Yeah, the sycamore and oaks they needed a larger planting area that we could accommodate with that narrow corridor.
And then on the smaller plants,
The shrubs.
right, there was a couple of natives, deer grass and buckwheat.
Yeah, you'll see the little N, that fancy little N there in the corner of the photo. Those are on these few slides. I have the natives identified, and then the others are not natives but California plants. And there's a larger landscape list. You probably had in the drawings. There's a lot more shrubs than what I'm showing here. Just because
Right.
you probably have quite a few slides to show us. But these are just some of the primary ones we're seeing.
So on the final design, is there going to be any yuccas, for instance, or manzanitas?
Yeah, we do have yucca and manzanita on there. There's one of them right there in the center and the top. And there's a couple other species on the overall plant list. Like I said, I didn't have it on here because it'd be quite a few pages to go through, but it's on the list.
Thank you, Brian. This looks great. I can't wait to see it being built.
Commissioner Dunn?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much for the presentation. This is very exciting to see the plan coming into, a really good picture for the Escondido. I had a few questions, though. When you mentioned 60% of landscaping is done, what should be the commissioner anticipate seeing the other 40% coming? What should we see? What should we anticipate seeing in that picture?
Yeah, let me clarify that. So the plans are at 60% construction documents. So it doesn't mean that we, it doesn't refer to the planting plan only being 60%. Actually, the planting plan is almost done as far as how many you see on there in the plans. It just means the overall construction documents from everything that we have to do on the project is at 60% completion.
At 60% completion, and then the other 40% anticipating, what are we seeing in those? Because I know that in construction, you have a schematic plan. Normally, the schematic plan between 70% to 80%, so you can kind of see the picture a little bit better than 60%, but because you mentioned 60% of landscaping, so it's going to throw me off a little bit. And I remember Commissioner Paul asking for the trees, so I said, okay, am I anticipating seeing additional trees for the landscaping, or maybe that just...
So, Commissioner Doan, I think the best way to indicate it is that when Brian walked through and you could really see the plans from the site plan view, and when you could see that in the color of the landscape, as Brian indicated, in terms of the plant palette and the locations of those types of amenities and where those plantings are going to occur, that is the plan. So in terms of kind of the concepts and the areas where this is going to go, that is, you're seeing 100% of that. What it is in terms of in terms of the construction value of the 6%, as Brian said, we've had to change out, as Commissioner Paul noted out, we had to change out a few of the trees because functionally it wasn't going to work with some of the utilities and the spaces that we had, and some of the irrigation systems, all those types of things aren't necessarily included in your packet because those come in the later phases. But in terms of layout, amenities, plantings, things like that, you have seen 100% of the layout and design of that between what we were provided and in the presentation.
Thank you. And the other question I had was that I didn't see any mention of public bathroom.
Yeah, there's no restrooms on
Oh, there's no restroom. Okay. Is there a reason why there's no restroom available?
Commissioner. So funding is always an issue and it's something that requires maintenance in the way that a restroom would. There are, if you look at the location where the trail goes, it passes right by Great Day Park, it passes by Washington Park. So there are facilities along the way, just not actually on the trail. There wouldn't be much space to put them on the trail anyways.
Thank you. The last question. It would be nice to have a bicycle repair station at the trail. You do see, I'm a bike, I like to bike a lot with my family, and then sometimes the bicycle broke down and we just kind of hard to fix. So I was wondering, I don't know, maybe the funding issue too, but it would be nice to have one.
I have written down and I will pass it along to those of us to see.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Dunn. Commissioner Ramirez?
Thank you both. It's really exciting, this type of projects is why I wanted to get involved in the planning commission. So I'm definitely excited. So I have a couple questions for you. The lighting that was highlighted there, is that existing lighting or is that additional lighting that will be coming into the church?
I believe there's some that's existing, but it's primarily going to be additional lighting that's coming on board, that's going to be put on site.
So there's lighting out there currently. The place that doesn't have lighting that will be adding it is on the north side at Date, all the way, if you go east to Midway, we'll get lighting. And then on the south side from Midway, we're going back all the way to Ash. And then from there, it's already lit, so that'll be the new site.
And I can tell you as part of our conversations, it's actually a really big team with Brian and our city staff and Joe and Danielle, obviously are here as well, are all part of this team. And again, safety and activation in terms of comfort level of utilizing this trail is a continuous mantra of this whole process. So I know that has been a key component, is making sure the lighting is there.
Great, thank you. And similar to Commissioner Dona, I'm a runner, so I actually ran the big trail earlier today, just to be ready for today's meeting. My name was those are my questions. The other question I had was signage. You pointed to signage along the trail. Will that be in multiple languages, or is there plans to be somewhat inclusive of how we, whether that's infographics rather than specific language, making it more visible, but that's more of a kind of a suggestion rather than a question. And then the other thing in terms of, and this is again probably more of a suggestion, but community gardens and the public art, I hope there's space for community engagement and kind of, I grew up in Escondido, and I remember a long time ago, in Escondido compact, we painted trash cans and decorated them and had art kind of to deter graffiti. So I hope, one, we can involve youth and community and what implementing community gardens and public art could look like. And then also kind of thinking to that point, I was curious about the sustainability of, one of the things that I noticed today is on the bike trail, there's a lot of patches of paint over because of graffiti and whatnot. So I know that DG would probably be a deterrent to the graffiti, but kind of keeping an eye towards lessening the cost of sustainability repair. I know that we got skin, and I know we didn't get that kind of full picture that you all have. So those are other things that I thought about, and then in terms of there's some components, and I'm not sure. I know you talked about safety just now, but just crime prevention through environmental design and how that might be incorporated. I know through the shaded areas or others, how we're building that in. And I know, I don't know how much the Escondido Police Department gets involved in terms of looking at also these designs and building this component. But I was just kind of some things that.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Rodriguez. Commissioner Serrato?
I have no questions, but just comments. I thought it was very well done. Love the plant palette, the way you incorporated the basket weaving from the local tribes, and I just am really excited to see this be implemented. So, good job.
Commissioner Weiler?
Yes, thank you for the presentation, and I too agree with my fellow commissioners on the questions and concerns that they have. My concern comes kind of more on a public safety side because there are stretches of those trails that it is pretty isolated. There's no eyes on those trail systems, and I get that the lighting is going to help. And the section that I'm probably most concerned about, because I've been on that section many times, and that's from Harmony Grove Road up to Center City Parkway. It's a little daunting sometimes going through there. And usually I'm with friends and such, so it's not that big of a deal. But I could see if somebody was going through there alone on their $2,000 e-bike, that they could be an easy target. So my concern is from a safety standpoint as to whether or not the city's going to be able to, have bicycle patrols or something going through there just for some sort of deterrent to potential crime. I've never been, bothered by anybody, some of the people that I've seen hanging out on the trail, yeah, I can see for some people, they may not want to use the trail. But that, again, that's the section that I've gone on most frequently. And then I've got a couple other comments. Seems like someone's ready to address this.
Yeah, Commissioner, my name is Joe Gallar. I'm the Director of Public Works. I can address some of the security issues that you kind of bring up. You know, lighting's going to help quite a bit, but we're also looking at adding more rangers to patrol the bike trail. You know, more patrols and more people using the bike trail, or more the different people using the bike trail, you know, hopefully we could make the bike trail a lot safer than what it is today.
All right, terrific. And what I didn't notice on the plans, and they were probably there, I just didn't notice it, were trash receptacles, so that, you know, people put their trash there instead of throwing it over the fence down into the flood control. And then I'm sure people will be walking their dogs, you know, little dog baggy station things I think would be helpful. If at least that could be considered in some of the planning and funding for those items. On the trash side of things, and this is more down in the flood control itself, and this may go to Public Works, I don't know, but somehow catching the trash maybe at multiple locations as the trash flows downstream. And the reason I know this is a problem is because I live on the Escondido Creek past Harmony Grove Road, and the amount of trash that comes down there is unreal. Part of that, I think, it has gotten worse lately in the past several years, but I think that's a homeless problem because they're living down in the creek bed. But if there's a way to at least catch some of it that does come downstream, you know, as the waters move and trash goes down into the flood control, I think that would be helpful. But overall, I'm excited about this. I've used the trail. I like the trail. I hope to see more people using it. I'm glad to hear that Public Works is considering getting more rangers that can actually go up and down the trail. I think that would be helpful, and at some point, you know what, the ne'er-do wells may not hang out there, and it may even help with the graffiti. So that was all the comments I had. Well done, staff.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiley. Yeah. Vice Chair.
Can I just comment that I think it's great that you're having more patrol, right? We talked about that for safety purposes. That was a brilliant idea about talking to the police department and maybe getting, obviously they're good at what they do. They're going to have some insight and some ability, you know, that we don't know, we don't deal with that. But have you all done that?
So our police department is very involved in projects such as this with our Setbacks projects, crime prevention through environmental design.
That's awesome.
So yeah, they definitely got their eyes on this project and others such as this.
Thank you so much. Very thorough.
Thank you. Okay, so I just have a few questions, and to reflect some of what Commissioner Paul was saying about natives. It strikes me that we might be missing an opportunity here. I really think this is great. I mean, it's really wonderful that we're going to be seeing all these great improvements. I also actually have biked the trail a bunch of times just recently and managed to get 2 or 3 flat tires from various debris in the path, in the trail itself. So I was thinking a bike repair could be at least a sign that points to where you might be able to find them. Of course, people with phones, you can do it that way. But in any case, the palette is what I'm thinking about. I recognize there's, I hear this phrase, California friendly. Is that California friendly plantings?
Yeah.
Which sounds like a marketing term to me, in terms of whether it's native or.
Yeah, it's a term used frequently, but it is, they're non-native and native drought-tolerant plants that are
right.
compatible with
current SoCal climate, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I think the opportunity that I think we're missing here is one for education for local people, with respect to what did our landscape look like before, and in so doing, perhaps having a lot more emphasis on native plants that are actually native to this valley, either originally when indigenous folks were here and using, but I know I heard the allusion to sycamore and oak as not being necessarily the trees that we can plant along this trail. I know that sycamores are particularly not necessarily desirable for public maintenance. They can be really challenging, but on the other hand, they are actually really a beautiful tree, and they are native to this area. So I would emphasize really looking at native plants, native plantings that are actually local to this area. I mean, the ones that you have identified are, of course, beautiful. They'll be absolutely wonderful to look at. However, I think with a bit of signage, we could actually speak to the landscape as it once was and what we have lost as a result of development, and how we can just basically do some education around that and really use local plantings as, and actually that would tie in nicely with the indigenous, with tribes and the work that you're doing with them as well, because they could, I'm sure, offer a lot of insights in that regard. So I just ask you to consider that going forward with respect to the native plants palette. I also recognize that there are challenges with maintenance and all of that, but I think to do a better job there, I think would be, because we can actually interpret it as such, which I think would make a difference. Let's see. I'm surprised that you call this primarily a fencing project.
It's funny.
Is it mostly fencing? I'm hoping it's not mostly fencing.
It came out of our multiple discussions in this, and Brian and I talked that oftentimes when you do trail projects, so much of the trail project actually just becomes a fencing because of safety and trying to open it up and make it more accessible visually, especially when you do these types of, when you have trails next to amenities like the creek. So, there's a lot of chain link, as we saw, and I'm sure as you guys have been out there. I think a big part that we can all agree on is removing that chain link and doing the improved fencing throughout is going to be a big deal. And fencing in and of itself and getting that installed is a lot of work. And there's a cost associated with that. But it makes a big difference in a big way. So it's kind of a nod to a lot of that work, especially up front that you're going to see is a lot of that improvement and getting rid of that whole chain link and seeing that new fencing is.
Right, so that list of items that we saw in one of the first attachment, that's largely hardscape work.
Hardscape,
Largely.
DG. Correct.
Yeah, there's
Hardscape, DG, but the green space, the green plantings, et cetera, are a piece of what's actually going to happen on the ground with the $8 million that have been received so far, correct?
Yeah, a lot of the cost is in planting, because we're doing, if you just average it out to 12, 15 feet per
Right.
miles. Yeah.
Okay. Shade structures, I noticed that's a great design. Are there going to be benches underneath there?
Yeah.
Or just the structure?
There's some seating areas underneath those.
And I'm just curious, is there any vision going forward for the channel itself? I saw the artwork, which was potentially great, but also in the sense of, I know, like, for example, in San Luis Obispo, their river walk area, they've got actual plantings within the channel, even though it is a flood control place, that you can still put, say, rocks, hardscape there, plus some plantings. I was just wondering if that was part of the vision going forward at all into the future. Or is that something that would be environmentally not possible because of the flood control vision?
I would say in terms of this vision right now, it's not associated with it. I think we're looking more towards, because it is primarily a concreted drainage situation. It's when you saw like the butterflies, for example, which I thought was a beautiful example of what can be done. Taking it and looking at it as a public art canvas, if you will, is I think the main thing that we can do. Being very familiar with the San Luis Obispo Creek Trail that you're talking about, I definitely feel that context, I think that's a much smaller also area in terms of what we're talking there compared to kind of just the distances and scale we have here, and so I think it's balanced. So I think right now we see it as an opportunity for art and activating it in that way, and then you never know in the future, dream day,
Right, I mean, that's what I was
These types
thinking.
of meetings are always good, but right now, this is all that we have in terms of,
I also recognize that there's enormous cost associated with trying to take out any part of a channel like that, so.
and there will be a lot of hands in the channel.
Yes. Okay. Great improvements, great job. Look forward to seeing what happens. I hope to take all of our comments into note and discuss, and hopefully we'll be able to see the results of some of that going forward. Great.
Chair,
Commissioner Paul?
I just want to take advantage of Joe being out in the audience because I think he's getting up ready to go. So I live off El Norte between Midway and La Honda, and your presentation about all the trees in Escondido showed all of those in pristine condition in the median there, but I want to tell you that a few of them need to be replaced.
Commissioner Paul, could you please put that in context? What presentation was that?
A couple of weeks ago, there was a presentation in the city about all the trees, and there was a interactive map where you could go to your neighborhood and you could actually see the tree inventory in your neighborhood. Right. So in the median in front of my street, it showed all these trees, but some of those trees are not there. They're dead.
Right. I was going to speak to that as well in our discussion later, but you're right.
But he was right there, so.
Yeah, we have a lot of trees that are unhealthy in the city. Yeah, we definitely know whether they're from drought related or pest related. Yes, we have identified quite a few trees in the city that are very similar to what you explained.
So you wanted to just clarify that?
I just wanted to say that the map shows that they're alive and doing well. And I want them to be put on the list of, no, they're not alive and doing well. They really should get some attention.
And we track the condition in a software called CityWorks. So when we will go out and evaluate the trees, we write their condition in there.
Right. If I may just follow up, since we have you in person. I really appreciated the presentation. I also observed it several times, actually, trying to make sure I understood it all correctly. But and I actually have a fair number of comments related to that I was going to bring up later on. But I'm just curious, the data that was presented, that was data drawn from what year?
So we did our tree inventory in 2014. Since 2014, we've updated that tree inventory.
Joe, can I intervene for a second? Does this have to do with the Escondido Creek Trail project?
Sorry. Yes.
Because we really shouldn't be discussing something that's not agendized.
Okay.
So I know I appreciate the use of Joe's here. That's great, but we really the procedural way to follow this is not to be discussing things that are not agendized. So.
Okay. Thank you very much. Then we'll bring it up at a later date.
Kurt, is it okay if we talk offline?
Yeah, you can contact Joe.
Yeah, contact me and we can talk offline.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Moving along then. So you don't, we're not recommending anything regarding the trail. We just simply provided our input. And so now we're moving on to agenda item, business item number 3, East Valley Specific Plan EIR review. Darren's going to present to us. Thank you.
Yes, good evening again. As Chairman, Commissioners, Darren Parker, an Associate Planner for the Community Development Department. I'm here to provide you with an update on the environmental document that's being prepared for the East Valley Specific Plan. Just to provide you a little bit of background history on the East Valley area in general. I know you've heard of the East Valley Specific Plan twice already. That would come to you and provided an update. We're going to update the status on that project now. The East Valley Area Plan was originally approved in 2004. The area plan was established to implement strategies to try and revitalize that whole area. In 2012, the City of Escondido updated the general plan and identified 11 target areas that would achieve the general plan visions. One of those target areas was the East Valley area. In 2020, the City of Escondido was awarded grant funding to to develop 3 different housing studies. One of those studies was the East Valley Pacific Plan. The city is developing the East Valley Pacific Plan in collaboration with local residents, local businesses, and local landowners. That will provide a future vision of the East Valley area. That project will also introduce hundreds of new multifamily dwellings to the area. The draft copy of that specific plan is currently online on the city's website. The East Valley Pacific Plan covers approximately 191 acres, and it's primarily comprised of private and public ownership. City staff, along with its consultant, is preparing a program environmental impact report. This report will inform the public, local community, organizations, responsible agencies, and other public agencies about the potential significant environmental impacts or effects resulting from the implementation of the East Valley Pacific Plan. The program EIR will outline possible mitigation measures to address those significant impacts, and will also provide project alternatives. A program EIR is one type of report allowed under CEQA, and different from a common project EIR, which examines environmental impacts on a specific development project. A program EIR is used to evaluate a plan or a program that has multiple components or actions that are related either to geographically, through application of rules or regulations, or as logical parts of a long-term plan. A draft program EIR is anticipated to be ready in late December of this year or early next year, and will be circulated for public review and comments for 45 days. During this period, the public and public agencies can submit comments to city staff on the draft program EIR. This slide shown outlines the required content or contents of a draft program EIR. Upon completion of the draft as a program EIR and public review period, the final program EIR will be prepared, which will include written comments on the draft program EIR received during the public review period. The city response to comments will be prepared and included, but the final program EIR will also include mitigation measures and monitoring as necessary, and any additional information will be included. This slide shows the overall process of a program EIR from beginning to end, from the initial study to determine the type of environmental review, to the circulation of the notice of preparation, to preparing the draft program EIR for public review, to the city's response to comments, and finally, the final EIR. Just to give you an update on where we're at to date, and so far, the project has completed several tasks already. One of them being the project initiation has been completed. A notice of preparation was circulated for public review in accordance with CEQA guidelines. NOP at that time identified several specific environmental issues. Those issues were related to air quality, biological resources, cultural and tribal resources, greenhouse gas, noise, and traffic. The program EIR will evaluate direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts resulting from the planning, construction, and operation of the project. The next step, once the technical studies have been prepared, staff will review and prepare a draft program EIR for public review. This slide shows the remaining items or milestones that need to be completed for the program EIR. The action before you today, or there's no action before you, it's just primarily an update on the status of the program EIR and where we are and what milestones that still need to be completed. And staff's here for any comments.
Any comments, questions from commissioners? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If I just may ask, actually, so when would that come before us for review? Because I saw a reference to a number of dates there.
They were planning to give you guys an update more than once throughout
Okay.
the process. This is just one of a few
Okay.
dates. I just wanted to give you kind of status and where we're at.
Right. Great, thank you very much.
I could probably clarify, we'll probably be bringing the EIR on the project through the commission here sometime in the late winter, early spring.
Thank you. Okay, moving along, business agenda item number 4, Brown Act presentation. Courtesy of Mr. Bird.
This is perfect because I wanted to Phil Donahue this thing. So I talked about the Brown Act, a brief presentation, just overall some refresher, 3 items. After we talked about that, AB 361 was passed. Let's rewind. First of all, remember the remote participation requirement. There are these rigid requirements for teleconferencing. We can do teleconferencing under the Brown Act, but in non-pandemic times, the general rule is it's authorized if you post agendas at each teleconference location. The locations need to be identified in the notice and agenda. The teleconference locations must be accessible to the public. So if you're at your house, you got to allow the public to come in there. So kind of strict, rigid requirements. But as we all know, during the pandemic, those requirements were relaxed, so we were teleconferencing for a lot of it, and people did not have to post that stuff at their homes and that sort of thing. If you recall from my last presentation, that executive order expired on September 30th. But in the meantime, AB 361 was passed. That extends this opportunity for local agencies to teleconference with relaxing these rigid agenda posting accessibility requirements. But the local agency has to meet a number of criteria, including you need to identify and include an opportunity for the public to attend via a call-in option or internet-based service option. So just one person out there is teleconferencing, and let's say we use the Jitsi platform, as you recall. We would have to allow the public to access that, or allow the public to call in, and you've probably seen other local agencies have done things like that. So knowing, kind of behind the scenes how it's worked with our IS, Internet Services Department, there's a cost to that. It's not something I think our IS department has encouraged. So it's probably even less likely under these rules that we would allow for teleconferencing unless we have, the pandemic heats up again and we have to, then this is what we would have to do. So that's it. It's effective last October 1st. It applies during a proclaimed state of emergency, which we are still in, and the law will expire on January 1st, 2024, unless there is no state of emergency at that time. So that was it, just a brief refresher on the refresher. Any questions?
Questions or comments? No? Yes.
I do. Just a quick question, Kurt. So, just in case we need to do teleconferencing at the last minute, for example, because I work full time and sometimes I don't get up until like 4 o'clock or 4:30. And right now, because of the pandemic and because we are protecting the environment, sometimes we have, like for example, I'm using the orange oil spill as an example. County of San Diego is kind of looking at it as like a prevention. We have to make sure. So sometimes I can call in for a meeting, and then I don't get out until 5, but I would love to attend the Planning Commission. So in that situation, with the new passed AB 361, what should I do in order for me to participate in the email via conferencing?
to be just totally frank and honest, I don't think it would be feasible on a whim like that. I think it would need some more, we would need to know well in advance. We would, staff would see what kind of cost and if our resources allow for that teleconferencing. So if it was something like 4 o'clock before a planning commission meeting, I don't think there's enough time to get a public call-in option and that sort of thing set up. But, if there is a situation, if you have something coming up, you would like to teleconference, you ask me or Adam, we're not going to flat out say, no, you can't. We'll present it to staff, we'll evaluate it, staff will evaluate it, and we'll get an answer back to you. I'm just kind of telling you behind the scenes that our resources are limited and there's costs involved to it.
If I may just add to that question. So remote, let's say you're out of town for a month or something like that, can you, we're not about teleconferencing, but remote, like telephone calling in, would that be feasible where you guys can discuss it and decide whether or not that's okay for?
It's the same thing.
It's the same principle.
Teleconferencing is call, video, or some combination of both, yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you.
Yep.
For the update. Not quite sure the pandemic is over.
Right, no, I'm always careful not to say post-pandemic because,
Okay, agenda item number 5, State of California housing legislation, presentation on recent state housing legislation updates.
Evening, Commissioners. I couldn't even see you back there, Nathan. I'm not used to this, having to look this broad to see the whole thing, usually right here, but anyway, good evening, again, Alan Feinstone, Interim Director of Community Development. So, over the last year, and particularly actually I was speaking to what happened in September, there were quite a few pieces of legislation that were passed. A number of them related to housing. The list that I've got here is not all inclusive. These were bills that were passed in September, and these are the ones that, in looking at them, both the planning division staff and the city attorney's office thought were fairly significant and justified some discussion and presentation, a little bit of information to the commission. They're just listed here based on in numerical order, not necessarily the days or order that they were passed. I think some of them were passed mid-September and some at the end of September. Obviously, SB 9, I'm sure that most of you have, or presumably all of you have heard about, and that's kind of the big one that we will touch on as we get later into the presentation here. But the others here also are relevant to what the city and our housing issues are and how to address things moving forward. So, there's a couple here that I'm not going to spend any time discussing. I just have on the list SB 791 allows HCD or requires the Housing Community Development Department of the state to create a unit of their department that would facilitate surplus land act projects. So that's kind of something that's on the periphery of what the planning division would deal with, but that was thrown into here. And then the other one that I'm not going to really get into much at all is AB 1174. Some of that information is going to be the same as what might have been part of the SB 8 discussion that I'll provide as well. So, starting there, SB 8 extends a number of the provisions of Senate Bill 330, which was the Housing Crisis Act of 2019. Extends those through the end of the decade, so through 2030. It revises the definition of a housing development project so that it includes any type of either discretionary, non-discretionary project, or even just a single-family home construction. It locks in certain standards, basically looks at your development standards that were in place. It gives you 3.5 years, kind of the idea of vesting without being vested per se, that your development standards that you were approved under are set and you don't have to worry about anything changing and you having to update the plans or update your project in order to address that for 3.5 years. It expands a relocation assistance offer to people who might be displaced from homes because of the future construction of larger projects. It extends that relocation assistance to all residents, not just people who would have been qualified as affordable housing residents. And then it also prohibits reduction of land use intensities through the general plan. So you couldn't, say, change a zoning or a land use category from urban to suburban, which would then lower that density, unless you would make up for that by increasing it elsewhere. Increasing it elsewhere, though, would then have concerns, and we run into considerations with regard to Proposition S. So that just is a way to look at this to say, you know, we can't reduce the densities allowed. That's something that I think that the state has been preaching for several years, and it's something that I think will, it's kind of an off-the-table discussion topic at this point. SB 10 is another piece of legislation, an interesting one that allows jurisdictions to adopt ordinances for the streamlined zoning process for 10-unit projects. It allows it in transit-rich areas and urban infill sites. It doesn't matter what the current zone of the property is, and it would be considered not a project under CEQA, meaning that there would be no CEQA review to rezone a property pursuant to this legislation and to approve a development of up to 10 units. Interestingly, this is one that can be overridden, or I should say, right now we've got a growth measure in place, Proposition S. It can be overridden by 2/3 vote of the council. So if we had a 2/3 vote of council to go down this road and say, all right, we're going to allow 10 units on that lot, even though the general plan zoning designation would only allow 1. If 2/3 of the council went along with it, that could happen. Now, it should be noted that SB 10 is not required. We do not have to enable this legislation through our zoning ordinance. We can choose to, but it's not something like SB 9 or a lot of these others that are mandated by the state. So just to be clear on that, it's nothing that we have to do. It's something that we have an opportunity to do if the city so desires. Density bonus law is being amended, or has been amended through SB 290 to address certain provisions to allow incentives and concessions for low-income student housing development. It expands the ratio of 1.5 parking space per unit requirement. That's the max we can require. It expands that to some projects that have, I believe, 40% of the units as designated and restricted as affordable for moderate income households, in addition to the application of that same provision to projects that have, I think it's 20% at low income and 11% at very low income. So that basically adds that moderate income threshold or moderate income category to projects that would allow parking reduction or the maximum of 1.5 space requirement. And it also revises reporting requirements to Housing Community and Development Department of the state there. SB 478 has a couple of interesting provisions. It's an interesting one because it really touches on two different aspects or two different topics that are seemingly unrelated, but other than the fact that they deal with housing. The first one is with regard to floor area ratio, and I will say, I just did want to apologize. In my staff memo, I had written floor area ration, so I noticed that. I tend to type that all the time, and I did notice that, so I was very careful when I was putting this together tonight. So we have limitations that we now can no longer require or impose, I should say, floor area ratio of 1.0 or less to projects that would have 3 to 7 units. And 1.25 or less to projects that would have 8 to 10 units. We also cannot impose development standards that would preclude projects from achieving these floor area ratios. So you couldn't say, all right, you can only do 2 stories and you've got lot setbacks, setbacks that cover 60% of your site. Well, then you're never going to hit a 1.0 FAR. So things like that is what it kind of gets at. The other aspect of SB 478 is with regard to housing element amendments. It requires, or it basically puts into place, kind of, I think a lot of jurisdictions were probably doing this already, ourselves included, when we put a draft housing element out for public review, it has to be out for a comment period for at least 30 days before we submit something to HCD, or before we would be ready to, I should say. Once we have that 30-day period, then we have a 10-day period that the city has to use at least 10 days to consider and thoroughly vet and look at and potentially make amendments to the draft based on comments received prior to sending it to HCD. And again, once HCD might send us some comments back, or if we need to provide them a subsequent draft, that subsequent draft needs to be posted at least 7 days prior to sending it, so it would allow again additional time for public input and opportunity to provide that. AB 1398 is another one that deals with housing elements, specifically the one, a couple things on this one, the housing element sites inventory. It establishes a 1-year deadline for rezoning requirements that would be necessary to implement the housing element. So in our case, we adopted a housing element that's still, again, going under some revisions and review modification. But we adopted a housing element that relies upon the East Valley specific plan to get a good percentage of the dwelling units that might be that are necessary to meet our RENA numbers. That adoption of that specific plan has to happen within 1 year of the statutory deadline for filing of our housing element, which would be April of next year. So when I was talking before how the EIR, the East Valley Specific Plan, would be coming to you guys prior to, or probably winter, early spring, that's online to hit that April 30th, I think is the date, April 30th deadline for getting that rezone done. And that goes along, we're still working obviously on the revisions that are necessary to the housing element. That's going to be a continuing work in progress. I don't know timing on that at this point, but some of the other information that we're dealing with with regard to the affirmatively furthering fair housing, AFFH, I'm going to leave it at that moving forward because that's a tongue twister. But the goals, policies, and quantified objectives are required in the housing element at this point. We've got a lot of that in there, and I know that there's more discussion. A lot of the comments, or some of the comments we had received on the housing element were to that effect. So we've been looking at that and figuring out what we got to do to implement or to incorporate the information. And the last thing two other things, I guess. The bill also spans the area of analysis. It requires federal, state, and local knowledge and data. It requires that we look both within our jurisdiction and compare our jurisdiction to the region. And we need to be looking for what factors may have contributed through the years to the current condition and location we're at with our housing. Finally, and this is one that I think that most cities and staff members are probably really happy about, is that this 4-year review cycle, that if you don't hit your deadline, you do it every 4 years, that's going away. So as long as we, I'm not going to say there's no other threats, there's always that the state has some muscle if they want. But that 4-year review cycle and having to redo this thing every 4 years instead of every 8, that's going away. So we're happy with that. Now the big one, SB 9. So SB 9 does a couple things, or a few things, 3 of them actually. The first one I'll say, the last one here I'll mention first. For tentative map extensions, it allows us to approve 24-month instead of 12-month extensions. That's really the minor part of this Senate bill, so I'm not going to say any more on that one. But the other 2 things that it deals with are 2-unit development projects to be permitted by right and what are called urban lot splits. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those. The 2-unit development projects are basically allows a duplex, whether it be attached or detached, on single-family zone properties and single-family properties within specific plan areas. It's allowed in urbanized areas. That's a U.S. Census Bureau designation, and it includes all of the city of Escondido. There are certain exceptions with regard to location-based criteria. If you're in a floodplain or if you're in an earthquake fault, there's a few of them in there, but generally the idea is that it's applying pretty broadly. One thing it does in one place, and this is at the bottom of the slide, that it does not apply is to properties within historic districts or with historic designations. So the old Escondido neighborhood, for instance, would not be subject to SB 9 provisions. The other one on here is with regard to demolition of tenant-occupied or affordable housing unit. It does not allow that, and it also has limitations on the amount of an exterior wall you can demolish. I don't know the rationale behind that, but possibly something to do with disturbance of tenants who might still be living in a place during construction. So what we can do from a zoning and development standpoint is we can impose objective zoning subdivision design standards. Objective such that you read it and you have there's no question, is it or isn't it? Objective, it's quantifiable, it's not qualitative. So we couldn't say, well, it's got to be some shade of blue. It would have to be, it's got to be sky blue, right, or whatever the designation is. So a couple of things as far as development standards that we can put in place. Setbacks are limited. We can't require them for projects that have units already existing. We can't require 4-foot setbacks in the side and the rear at other locations or on other properties. We can still require our front yard setback requirements. We can still have our height limitations, etc. We are not allowed to require more than 1 parking space per unit. We may not be able to even require that if a property is close to a high-quality transit corridor, which I believe is more than 2 transit lines that cross at that location with 15-minute intervals. And I think Escondido Boulevard, and obviously the transit center, a couple other places in town do have that. And they, like I said, can be attached or detached. They cannot be used for short-term rentals. There's a minimum 30-day lease term that would be required on projects from duplexes or the 2 units that would be built subject to these provisions. The other aspect of SB 9, the urban lot splits, this is something that's going to be more, involve our engineering side of things as well, our subdivision maps. Parcel maps would be basically a 2-lot parcel map, subject to all the provisions of the Subdivision Map Act, except as modified by the specific Senate bill, which modifies the Subdivision Map Act. So, it's allowed in single-family zones and specific plans that allow single-family zoning for single-family homes. The minimum lot size is not limited by the zone, so it's not you've got an R16 property and you can have 6,000 square foot lot sizes. If you had a 6,000 square foot lot, hypothetically, you could divide that into 2 3,000 square foot lots. Not require correction of nonconformity issues in order to do this. So if someone had built something that was too close to a property line, and that we can't say, all right, you got to fix that in order to get your lot split done. Can't use you can't do this on a property that was already done through an urban lot split, so you can't continue to slowly make them smaller and smaller and get more and more lots out of that. And you can't kind of collude with someone else to do the same thing, right? I'm going to buy a property, I'm going to split it. Hey, I'm going to sell it to you. You can split that one, and maybe once you get that, you can sell yours to Owen, and he can split it. So that even if you can't be doing that with each other. Certain criteria, again, or certain exceptions with regard to location-based criteria. Same thing with regard to demolition, same issues as well for historic properties. And as far as objective zoning standards, we have to allow, if lot size is so dictated, if someone had a lot that was, let's say, 2,400 square feet, they could hypothetically divide it down to 1,200 square feet each. That would be the bare minimum. The bill also has a 60-40 lot split percentage, so no more than, you can't have a lot that's, 10,000 square feet and a lot that's 2,000 square feet. It would have to be, 60-40, 4,000, 6,000, whatever you want to do on that. Lots would have to be able to accommodate construction of 2 800 square foot units on each new lot. Setbacks and parking requirements would be the same as for those 2 unit developments that we just discussed. A couple of interesting parts of this is that we cannot require right-of-way dedication or offsite improvements. So that's going to be an interesting one. We're going to have to figure out how to address, because ultimately street right-of-way needs to be improved at some point. So, and you don't want someone building something to a line that is no longer going to be. If we're able to widen something and you got your front property line, well, your setback can't be measured from a property line that's going to move in the future, and then you would have a property that's substandard as far as that setback. Alright, and we can require easements for public services and utilities, etc. So, urban lot splits also are limited, those lots are limited to residential use. Owner must occupy one of the units for at least the first 3 years. They're supposed to sign an affidavit to that effect. We do not have to allow ADUs or JADUs on these properties if they are also allowing the duplex, like a 2-unit development. So we can say, we have to say you can split it, you can build 2 units on each one, but we can preclude an ADU on top of that. So, and then again, just like with the duplex thing, they cannot be used for short-term rentals. I know that was a lot to swallow. Be happy to answer any questions to the best of our ability here.
Questions, comments from commissioners? Commissioner Paul?
Yeah, thank you very much, Adam. So the last thing you said was if you can split it, you can put 2 units on each, but not on an ADU. You can split your 6,000 into 2 3s and put 2 units on each 3, or did you misspeak?
Yes.
No, I did not misspeak.
So it is four units.
Correct.
Okay, and so I had read somewhere that there was still going to be a minimum lot size, and that was confusing to me.
1,200 square feet.
So it's not the existing minimum, it has to meet the existing minimum. I was thinking if the existing minimum is 6,000 and you have 6,000, then you can't split it. But so I misread that, or they miswrote it. That's why. Okay, and I have a couple more questions. Can you bring up the slide for the SB 10? You said we don't have to do that, not mandatory. What do you expect that we'll do? Are you going to bring something to City Council?
At this point, we are our attention is on SB 9 and how to address that, because the implications of that are going to be coming much quicker. We haven't really looked at this in any detail yet and come up with any thoughts on it, any direction that we might give.
Okay. Can you try to remember that? I'm interested.
Of course.
And then the SB 478. Do we already comply with the FAR requirements?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'll have to look at it. Interestingly, our floor area ratio, it's tied to the zone of a property, not the number of units. So that's where I can say actually for sure we don't address it apples to apples here, right? Ours says, okay, for an R2 zone, you can have an FAR of 0.5. I don't know the numbers for sure. But what if you have an R2 zone that's got 30 units, or what if you have an R2 zone that's got 2 units, right? So it's the way that the math works, it's apples to oranges right now.
And so are you going to have to do some investigation?
Yeah, that'll be something that's on our, that I've actually already put on our next omnibus code update.
And then, last question, the AB 1398, the 4-year cycle. So I was going to ask, otherwise, what's the status of our housing element?
Yeah, I think I alluded to it. We're still working through the comments that we've been provided, and we're going to need to get some further input from a couple of agencies, likely. I think we're going to probably wind up pulling or meeting with our housing subcommittee, council housing subcommittee, and kind of giving them some info, an update. But really, I don't have a timeline for you on it at this point. SB 9 has kind of jumped to the top of my list right now.
And so the pressure is off because of this, removing the 4-year?
No, I'm not going to say the pressure's off because the state still has some muscle that they can give to us. But we initially, when we went through the process, we hit the August whatever date to get that the housing element certified or filed with HCD. That was before they had said, okay, after this one, you don't have a 4-year cycle. So had we known then what we know now, we probably would have said, okay, wait, let's get that second letter from HCD. Let's make those changes. Let's address that prior to bringing it forward, right? Rather than having to do it, look at it again, and bring it back, right?
Okay, so the 4-year cycle is effective now. We don't have to worry about.
Correct.
That wasn't clear in the presentation. It sounds like it's coming.
Oh, it's coming.
Thank you very much.
So just to follow up on that, then will the Planning Commission have an opportunity to review the revised version based on HC? Because I did see that letter, and there's certainly some.
Definitely,
As I said, the affordable housing, all that stuff. Okay.
As a general plan amendment, it'll be coming back through Planning Commission to City Council in the same manner.
Right. Okay. Very good. Other questions for Mr. Feinstein? Commissioner Weiler.
Yeah, thanks for the overview on this. Interim, what do we call you now? Interim Community Development Director? Yeah, thanks. On SB 9, if you can go to that and the 2-unit developments. So SB 9 now says that any 2-unit development has to be approved ministerial, and essentially would that mean if you're doing the lot split, you still got to follow the MAP Act. But the review of the architecture and such, that just goes straight to a building permit?
Correct.
Wow, no, okay. Interesting. Have you guys been seeing any development proposals coming in that have been, citing SB 9 as a way to decrease the review process?
So we haven't had any, at this point, we haven't had any applications come in for these types of projects because it's not in effect yet. We have had a lot of inquiries. I will say that from what I've talked to my staff that fields our phone calls and works our counter and everything, they're saying that they're getting more inquiries on these than ADUs now. So.
Yeah, I can imagine so. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate all the update.
Thank you. So that was along the lines of my other question too, for the SB 9. So you do anticipate, because I've seen all these comments and reviews in the papers around, well, homeowners got to bear the cost of construction, et cetera. It's unlikely that they'll be doing that, particularly given they need to stay in their house for 3 years. I was just wondering what your staff's.
We've discussed that to an extent, and it sounds like, the more you think about it, it's like, well, our people are actually willing to take advantages. I think that you're not going to see as much of the urban lot split as you will of the 2-unit development.
Right.
Lot splits are more costly and take more time and more engineering, more behind it, and you're going to wind up with, you wind up with a sellable property, but there's a lot more to doing that than there is to building what in essence is a bigger ADU.
Right.
So, and I think if you've seen, I don't know how much you are aware of what all the provisions in our ADU ordinance are, but a lot of these things, as far as minimum unit sizes, setbacks, parking, a lot of that is pretty similar to ADU law, and that's all been dictated
Other comments, questions regarding the, thanks for the overview, that was really helpful, appreciate it. This will be accessible.
I can make it accessible.
I'd appreciate that,
Sure.
yeah, that'd be helpful.
Mhm.
Thank you. Okay, oral communications, there aren't any more, as I understand it. Notes from planning commissioners? Anything for the good of the order? Commissioner Paul?
Sure, I submitted something to staff and asked them to share it, and they say I have to tell you that I submitted something to staff and asked you to share it. That was a month ago, so.
If you can let them know, and then I'll be able to send that out to them, what the item is that you wanted to discuss.
I think it was an annual report on the cost of parking,
Of what?
on parking structures.
So now that that's on the table as at a public forum, we'll be able to send that information out along.
Okay. Other notes, comments from commissioners? I have a few. Mr. Whitman, I don't know if it's appropriate, but it seems to me that this might be an opportunity for me to give an update on the council discussion of September 21, where they discussed the tree canopy that Commissioner Paul was talking about earlier. And then also I just have just a summary of that, because to my mind, that discussion agenda item at City Council was in direct response to our subcommittee work on tree canopy, or rather I should say a green infrastructure plan for Escondido, at which point Councilmember Garcia put that item of a tree canopy and understanding more about trees on the agenda for City Council, and I listened to that session and just was wondering if it's appropriate to bring that up, given we had a subcommittee work on that.
Yeah, if you can just briefly touch on it, and if it's something that it sounds like maybe we anticipate a little more discussion on it, maybe that's something we should toss on the agenda for the next.
That's fine. That would be fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we place that on the agenda then for the next time? I'd like to just report out on that discussion that they had, and also some questions that I have as a result that I'd like the commission to discuss.
Right, would you like Joe to be here for that, Chair?
That would be wonderful, but
I will ask of his availability.
can extend the invitation. Thank you.
Most of the other departments aren't used to meetings starting at 7, and they're really?
Well, in the interest of full engagement.
There you go.
Another question I had, my understanding is that you had mentioned earlier, Adam, that there would be an update to the environmental justice element of the general plan as well as the safety element.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering when we can expect to see those drafts or for review by the Planning Commission.
Sure, those are probably timing and scheduling along after the housing element work. We've been working with our fire chief and Mr. Nicholas, who was here earlier.
Right.
He's leading the effort from the planning side of it. But with a couple of the other items that we've got that are high priority items, that's gonna lag a little bit. But
So that'll-
I'm hoping in the spring.
Spring sometime? Okay.
I'm hoping that's the goal, spring.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out that for the environmental justice element, as the state has requested that the city include that, there's an awful lot of information in the climate action plan to inform that, as you know.
Yes,
Okay.
we are definitely going to leverage that.
Yeah, that'll save you a fair amount of time. That's all I have for today. Actually, if I just may ask, I'm just curious, you had a recruit a while ago, I think, for a senior planner. Was that Mr. Nicholas?
Sean, Mr. Nicholas, he started back in end of May, I think, is our principal. We've got a senior planner who's starting on the 25th of this month.
Yeah, and I just asked because I recall at one point our climate action plan required or suggested that we have a senior planner or some type of planner be responsible for coordinating climate action.
Yeah, one of the goals and roles of this individual who's going to be our senior planner is some of the implementation for our advanced planning documents, our advanced planning work, climate action plan, housing element, a couple of other things. At this point, staffing levels are such that I'm going to need to throw her on other projects as well, but that's the goal.
That's the intent. Okay,
Mhm.
Thank you very
Right.
much. Okay. Anything else? Good in the order. Okay, the meeting is.
I got something.
Who does? You do, Adam. I'm sorry, director's report. Why do I always?
I understand, that was only, that was not on there until a couple, I think Mike's last meeting, he put it on there, so. So I just wanted to let you know that as far as the next meeting, I don't see anything for an agenda in 2 weeks, so I doubt we'll be having that. I'll let you know for sure. Wanted to also just check availability for it as we get closer to Thanksgiving. That week of Thanksgiving is the fourth Tuesday of the month. So I don't know, and I'm not saying we have anything scheduled then, but I just wanted to see if people are not in town, we'll obviously avoid it, but if anyone's planning on leaving and not being in town, let me know, and we'll just cancel that meeting for sure. But,
That would be Tuesday, the 23rd.
yes. So if you're not going to be here,
I will not be here.
all right, then we'll scratch that one off. So very good. So we will.
Commissioner Weiler also not here.
Yep.
Correct. I won't be, well, I can change my plans, but I wasn't,
Yep.
I was hoping we wouldn't have a hearing, put it that way.
We try to avoid them, but on that date. But occasionally, if we needed to, we would. So not a problem. And then the other thing I was just going to ask of you, and I haven't done much of it yet myself, but I wanted to see who, and for next time, and I'll put this on the agenda, to discuss any good sessions that anyone viewed at the APA conference. So I know that we all had access to that virtual conference, and I think we've all still got that access through the end of the calendar year. So at our next meeting, if anyone has any of the sessions that they viewed that they thought were very good, very beneficial, and we'd get a lot out of it as a group, if you want to bring those and kind of let us know so we can all kind of compare notes and get some good ideas of sessions to tune into. So
Full disclosure on my part, I never got the links. So maybe I could get access in hindsight to view.
Yep.
And or
Did anyone get the links?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I never got a notice that said the links are now available.
that links are available or anything like
I
that.
never got.
Okay. Well, we will make sure we
I
get
think
that to
it's in the
everyone.
app. I think if you click on the app, could we download it?
Oh, I didn't use the app.
I didn't use the app either.
Yeah, we'll double check and we'll get that out to you guys again. It's,
Or at least instructions as to where and where that app is, because I don't think I even downloaded it.
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I mean it's archived. We've got access through the end of the year. So
great.
Name the app. It's called Crowd Compass Events.
But that's for the registration.
Well,
It's an app too.
we'll get you guys all the information to make sure you can get it. And I do apologize. I didn't realize that you hadn't sent that info. So.
And just as a FYI, we didn't, about you all, I did not get the packet of information until today.
Yeah, I apologize on that. That's purely my
I mean,
so.
for this particular meeting and all these materials, it was not a huge issue, but had it been something a little bit more significant, that would have been a challenge.
Understand.
Oh, yeah, I maybe got it today. My mail doesn't come until Monday at 5 o'clock. I never even checked my mailbox. I got it because you emailed
Right.
it. So I have a private mailbox that you guys send some stuff to me. If you send that, I get that much earlier than when you send it to my house. My house's mail is terrible.
Yeah,
I think Monday was a holiday.
oh, that's right. Yesterday was
I think that's why nobody got any mail yesterday.
There we go.
Okay, can we adjourn then? Is that it?
That's it for me.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. Have a nice evening.